Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
When I was 18 years old, British paratroopers opened fire on unarmed demonstrators protesting in what the state regarded as its own streets in the city of Derry in the north of Ireland. 14 people were killed in broad daylight.
It was 42 years ago, this very week. A Rubicon had been crossed. Nothing was ever the same again, in Britain or in Ireland.
As part of the Good Friday Agreement, the British state agreed to set up a public inquiry into the events. It proved the longest and most expensive in history, 12 years, costing £200 million. The champion of the victims' families and Britain's most celebrated Queen's Counsel is Michael Mansfield, QC, and I'm glad to say he now joins us on board the Sputnik. Michael, thank you very much indeed for joining us. This very week, on the eve of the anniversary, some people in some parts of Derry were climbing up lampposts, hanging the paraphernalia and flags of the parachute regiment who did the killing on Bloody Sunday. So clearly the issues, the divisions in the community haven't gone away. But I wanted to ask you, as the leading champion of the families in the Savile inquiry, if you think that the families got justice.
Well, the families are the ones to answer that, but I happen to know what they would say were they sitting right here with us now, because they've been asked it many, many times. And the answer is always the same. Absolutely yes. Unequivocal yes. And the reason they say that is, as in your introduction, I mean, you have to think of the historical context in which it was launched. They campaigned for that for a long, long time, and eventually persuaded across the divide, across the political divide, a Tory leader and a Labour leader, that this was the way forward. And they both agreed at that one time that there should be a public inquiry of the kind that was eventually instigated. Now, the kind that was instigated, it's not like any other. It was itself historical. I mean, you were asking the panel there to look back over 30 years. And if you can imagine trying to trawl over 30 years and trying to bring in the evidence of all the various stages, the build-up to what happened on Bloody Sunday, it was an amazing exercise. And I think eventually will be seen as a sort of historical epic to have conducted. I know it cost money, of course it did, but the people involved in it felt at the end of the day, as part of the peace process, this was putting things on record and putting the record straight, because you will remember these particular families were branded as terrorists themselves, and they denied it, and they were blamed, and they wanted that to be sloughed off, and in the end it was.
There's been no charges yet, am I right in saying, arising out of it, although the body of evidence itself could not be used as part of the deal for prosecution. People who gave evidence could have then been re-interviewed by the police and have given the same evidence, and it could have been adduced to bringing people to book. We have a fairly clear idea, they're named as A and B and C and so on, of who was firing these fatal shots at unarmed, peaceful demonstrators on the streets of the British state, but no one has been brought to book.
I think it gives rise to a very interesting, it's a dilemma for the families, some of the families, and the first point is this. I always viewed it a little bit like the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In other words, it was a necessary lancing of the boil in order to move on. In other words, you put on record what really happened. And for some people, that was actually enough to get that writ large, as it were, over history, to get the truth known. But for others it wasn't, because they want accountability. They want somebody at the end of the day to be made accountable, in other words, prosecuted. So there's a division of opinion. Not all the families necessarily think the same way. And of course there is, as with South Africa, there was an interesting, as it were, formula worked out. Now, in the Derry case, the formula was this. It wasn't that the evidence in the inquiry couldn't be used. The evidence that you give against yourself couldn't be used against you. But if you gave evidence against me, what you said in the inquiry against me could be used. Okay. So it's an interesting, and in South Africa, they had a slightly different arrangement. And I think this is very important for the future, because there are all sorts of theatres of war in the world where this sort of arrangement should be considered. In South Africa, what they said was, well, we're going to give you the opportunity, you the perpetrator, to meet the victim, and we're going to give you the opportunity to confess. Now, if you don't confess, then you might be prosecuted. But if you do confess, then you get immunity. Now, of course, that's a slightly different arrangement. But it produced all sorts of people coming out of the woodwork and rising to the surface, and so the people in South Africa felt, expensive though that was, that it was an exercise well worth undertaking. So I think, going back to Derry, I think the families say to themselves, and will say to the world, we did get justice in the end of the day, and if you've been there, as I was on the day that the report reached Derry, it was, you know, I'm not religious, but I think I'm a bit spiritual. I have to say, you know, the spirits of Derry just rose up off the streets. And I've never been anywhere like, well, I have since in Hillsborough for Liverpool, but that was something I'd not experienced before, was a people felt at last that the burden that they carried had been lifted.
Do the families accept the apology coming from Prime Minister David Cameron?
Yes. I'm not a Tory, far from it, but, you know, credit where it's due. I watched his speech. We weren't allowed to, you know, go into public before he spoke in the House of Commons. And his speech in the House of Commons was brilliant.
It was on the Finucane case also, actually. I think he was sincerely apologetic.
I think he may have been pushed into a situation whereby he didn't have a lot of options. But nevertheless, you can have mealy-mouthed people who don't rise to it. He rose to it, I have to say. He did the same for Hillsborough. He rose to it and gave, you know, an unvarnished, untarnished apology. That's what they wanted.
And the fake, I call it fake, you're an officer of the court, probably can't, the Widgery inquiry was one of the most shameful whitewashes, the original inquiry into Bloody Sunday. It's hard now, looking back on it, to avoid having your breath taken away by the brazenness of that whitewash.
Well, I suppose I'm a bit sanguine. Yes, it was a whitewash, there's no question about that, an orchestrated whitewash. But I started practicing at about that time, so that's the beginning of my career, not quite the beginning, but near the beginning. And one has to recognise that there was a sort of attitude of mind at that time. There was an institutional denial that the institution themselves ever gets anything wrong, and an institutional, almost automatic knee-jerk reaction to support the agents of the state. And that goes right the way through to the Lord Chief Justice being actually visited by the Lord Chancellor and all, having private meetings about how he's going to organise the inquiry. So, I mean, it's a shocking episode. And I don't want to shut the door on that, because I want to say, be careful, because these things can occur again when people in power are desperate to hold on to power. And we have at the moment, I think, in the world, I mean, we have Mr. Snowden effectively locked up for telling the truth. And he's regarded as a spy because he's blown the whistle on the people who are really spying on all of us. So it seems to me we have to be super alert for this ability of major institutions to say, it's all right, don't worry, we're looking after you. No, thank you.
Only people of your age and mine and older were there at the time, can remember the shots, can remember that grainy footage on our black and white TVs. And we have many, many viewers overseas. Summarise, if you would, Michael, the findings of the Saville inquiry. What actually happened on that day? Official, now.
Well, the official finding is really quite a short one, and it's for that reason, it's cogent. I mean, what they're really saying at the ground and on the ground is that there was a march. Nobody disputes that. And it was effectively meant to be a peace march, ending up with Bernadette Devlin and other well-known figures addressing the march about civil rights, which civil rights in the North I can spend obviously another hour on that, the way they were breached, particularly for the Catholic communities, and a part of Derry known as the Bogside was closely identified with that. So in other words, whether it's voting, housing, employment, all the normal things were denied in some measure to the Catholic population in a Protestant-dominated north of Ireland. That's what it was really about. So they were marching because they said, we've had enough of this. We need to be recognised. So the march, of course, the government didn't want. And as is happening in Egypt at the moment and elsewhere in the world, they're banning anything they don't want. So the march was banned politically, but they carried on. And so the troops were brought in. Now, the troops, of course, have no love of, some of them anyway, certainly had no love, and they had undoubtedly formed, and Wilford was the commanding officer at the time, and he's quite proud of it. He had formed views about people who he regarded as insurgents. And how do you deal with insurgents? Well, of course, the British have had a lot of experience of dealing with insurgents, whether it's, you know, in the Middle East or Malaya, and so on. So they practiced how they deal with it. And they brought the, if you like, the tactics of the military onto the streets of Derry, onto the streets of the United Kingdom as it then stood, obviously. And the tactics were essentially, you go in hard. And you shoot first and you ask questions afterwards. And if you happen to have shot the wrong people, then you have to say, but they shot us first. They're the terrorists, and we just, and the problem that came out of this judgment, effectively, and it's never been resolved, of course. One is that, the decision was that these were effectively unlawful killings because the people who were killed were not armed terrorists. So if they're not the armed terrorists, you have to say to the army, well, where were the people you were shooting at, who you said were shooting at you? Of course, they don't exist, do they? The final judgment is, effectively, unlawful killing on the streets of the United Kingdom by agents of the state. And that's why a number of families very recently have been saying, and certainly it is being considered as I speak, that whether there should be prosecutions relating to those people who pulled the trigger. But can I just develop it, because I'm concerned about those who pull triggers, but actually, how do they get to that position? Sure. I'm much more interested in the layers above, and the Savile inquiry didn't really take it right up to the top, because actually, in my view, there is an element of responsibility that can be traced right through to the top.
To the cabinet room?
Yeah, to the cabinet room.
Michael Mansfield, QC, if I was ever in trouble, and I hope I never will be, I wish I'd had you in my corner. After the break, we'll be looking at Europe's most explosive flashpoint, where Western governments are doing everything they can, literally, to fan the flames. The Ukraine. I'll be right back.
What is our story? Who's writing it? And where is it leading to? Seeking true bearings, we seem to turn to the news. But take heed, for the medium is the message, and this most viral meme on the planet is now the method for defining collective reality each night. If it's not on the news, it didn't happen, right?
On June 16, 1941, we had a graduation party at school, and the war broke out.
The shops were always full of goods.
In September, Leningrad was blocked.
One day, Mum went and saw that all the shelves were empty.
In November, they bombed the Badaevsky warehouses. It was the main storage place for all the food in the city. People were eating the earth because it had small traces of sugar in it. I tried to eat it as well, but I couldn't.
That night, there was incredibly heavy bombing. There was a direct hit on that very shelter, and everyone was buried underneath. All of them were dead.
speak your language. Want news, programs and documentaries in Arabic? It's all here on RT. Reporting from the world's hotspots, VIP interviews, intriguing stories. Are you here? Then try RT Arabic. To find out more, visit arabic.rt.com.
Welcome back to Sputnik. President Putin this week warned the European Union to keep their noses out of Ukraine, where fascists, far-right nationalists and others are mounting a violent and increasingly armed assault on the elected president and his government. Policemen have been killed, others set on fire, all on primetime TV. If the same sort of uprising happened in London, the Mayor Boris Johnson this week said the police should go medieval on the rioters.
And in terms of the media coverage of the protest in Ukraine, the Western networks, who would be cheering for their own police forces to go medieval on protesters if these things were happening in their own countries, are instead cheering on the Molotov cocktail shakers abroad.
In his State of the Union speech, President Obama expressed that in Ukraine, we stand for the principle that all people have the right to express themselves freely and peacefully and have a say in their country's future, with the emphasis on peaceful.
US right-wing Republican Cold Warrior John McCain, however, is marching on the streets of Kiev, and the EU has sent its rather less savage, the Baroness Ashton, as a mediator to a non-EU country where the elected government hasn't even invited her.
Joining us now to discuss what's happening in Ukraine is regional expert, author and broadcaster Neil Clark. Neil, thanks for joining us.
Hello, George. Hi.
On the Sputnik.
Welcome.
We've seen policemen being stabbed on TV.
Yep.
We've seen policemen on TV being set on fire. If this was happening in Occupy Wall Street or happening in Tottenham, the police would shoot the perpetrators dead.
Yeah.
Yet the British political and media class are on the side of the rioters. Explain.
Well, absolutely. I think the double standards are absolutely glaring in this, George, because just imagine if in London we had far-right, neo-Nazi, racist, ultra-nationalist groups protesting in the streets of London, rioting in the streets of London, led by, say, the BNP and the EDL. Let's just imagine that was happening. And that these rioters were attacking the police, were throwing Molotov cocktails at them, and were trying to occupy government buildings in a blatant attempt to bring down the elected government. Can you imagine what the British establishment, what the British elite journalists would be saying? As you said, these people would be rounded up, they'd be put to prison, and the whole movement would be closed down. Yet, the very same British elite is cheering on these people that are doing this in the Ukraine. And it's not sort of borderline. These people are neo-Nazis. These people are fascists.
Well, let's look at the ontology of it, because our friend Seamus Milne in The Guardian this week has analysed it in detail. Not only is the core of this body of rioters openly fascist, the Svoboda, it actually has been outflanked on its right by even more extreme fascists who say that Ukraine is run by Jews. And Svoboda, of course, have torchlight processions in Lvov, which they actually control in western Ukraine. Torchlight processions in remembrance of the fascist collaborator with the Nazi occupation of Ukraine.
Stepan Bandera.
Describe the makeup of this motley
Well,
crew.
we've got to look back at history and look back at the history of the Ukraine during the 1940s. And when the Soviet Union was attacked by Nazi Germany, you had large sections of Western Ukraine actually supporting the Nazis. And the Ukrainian independence movement helped the Nazis in this. And the man who was in charge of this movement was a man called Stepan Bandera. And it's his posters, his pictures of him that are being portrayed and being held by the so-called democratic, pro-democracy protesters in Kiev. It's just like, as I said, having far-right neo-Nazis marching through London holding pictures of Sir Oswald Mosley, and what the outrage would be from the British establishment about that. Even worse,
of course, some of the British media did support Oswald Mosley at the time.
Absolutely, good point.
But I want to pause you on this question of the hatred of Jews, anti-Semitism. There are people on the so-called left, as well as in the so-called mainstream, who are forever hunting a stray remark that can possibly be interpreted as anti-Semitic
Yeah.
on the part of Palestinians or Arabs or Muslims
Yeah.
or those who support them. Yet here we have prominent US politicians and prominent EU politicians sharing platforms with openly anti-Semitic fascist organizations. How come the media is not highlighting this?
Well, it shows to me that this, the so-called fake left, as I like to call them, and the British elites, their kind of war against anti-Semitism is a sham. Same as their so-called crusade against homophobia is a sham. It's used highly selectively because, as we know, there are people who spend 24/7 on Twitter monitoring genuine socialists for so-called anti-Semitic comments, anything, the Palestinian movement, etc., for any comment that could be construed or misconstrued as anti-Semitic. And yet you've got John McCain, who's a pin-up boy of the fake pro-war left, the neoconservative American senator, going out there, having breakfast with Mr. Tiambok, who is a man who has a history of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic rhetoric. He said in 2004 that Ukraine was run by a Muscovite Jewish mafia. This is a man who is a homophobe. He's outspokenly opposed to homosexuals. And yet you've got McCain, who's the great hero of the cruise missile left in Britain, having breakfast with him and standing on a platform with him.
Is this the beginning of the end for the Ukraine as a state? Are we looking at potential partition? Because the east and the south of the country is wholly against the events in Kiev. Indeed, some parts of Kiev are against it. But there seems to be a dichotomy between west and east, with the south being with the east.
Well, I think we've got to look at the bigger geostrategic political picture of this, and the battle for Ukraine is really a battle being launched by Western elites. The Western elites want Ukraine. They want to lock it into what they call Euro-Atlantic structures, which means getting the Ukraine into the EU and into NATO, and to prize it away from Russia. Because for these Western elites, 2013 was a very bad year. It was a year of reverses. They hell-bent on regime change at any cost in Syria. It hasn't happened.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of payback time now for Russia. They want to get Ukraine away from Russia. And they don't care how much bloodshed, whether they plunge the country into civil war. And as they've shown with Syria, they will go to any extent. They will back any people, however extreme, in order to achieve this aim. So this is all about the West trying to lock Ukraine into their empire, really. We've seen from Yugoslavia in 1999, Iraq in 2003, in Syria, and now in the Ukraine, that when the Western elites want regime change, they will go to any length to get it.
And
No
they'll
matter what the
ally with
bloodshed is.
anybody,
And they will
however
ally with
extreme.
Al-Qaeda, they will ally with
it's
Al-Nusra
analogous.
Front, they
We're
will
with
ally with Nazis.
Al-Qaeda in Syria,
Yeah.
and we're with the anti-Semitic fascists
In Ukraine, yeah, exactly.
It's about the enemy of my
Yes.
enemy is my friend, and Russia is their enemy.
The people who are rioting in Kiev and in other cities do not represent the majority opinion in the Ukraine. There are elections due next February. February 2015 is the next presidential elections. Now, if you were a Democrat in Ukraine, you'd say, well, let's wait for these. And so why aren't the opposition waiting for the elections? If they're so confident that they've got majority support, why not simply wait a year and take power legally? Why are they trying to force out Yanukovych? And I think that gives the game away. They don't have the support that we're led to believe. The stakes are very high here, George, because if Ukraine does get linked into the West, if Ukraine does become a member of NATO and become a member of the EU, there's going to be a lot of money in this for the Western elites.
Will Russia actually be forced to become proactively involved in Ukraine? There is, as you know, a very sizable minority of Russian-speaking people. Russia is vitally threatened by the West moving in to the Ukraine conflict.
Yes.
How dangerous can this get?
I think it's very dangerous because I think if I was a Russian, an ethnic Russian living in Ukraine, I'd be extremely worried now what would happen if these fascists do come to power or are allowed to share power, because we know quite clearly that the West will allow them to come to power.
Broadcaster, writer and analyst Neil Clark telling it like it is. Now it's your turn to tell us what you think in the social media review. Gayatri, what's rattling the pipes?
On Ukraine, a lot. From Germany, we got Beklopptes Kangaroo saying, because German Adenauer Stiftung from the CDU is able to do it and wants to create a counterbalance to Putin.
The Germans are extremely busy in Ukraine. Klitschko, the heavyweight boxer that you were just talking about, he is Germany's man in this picture. And it's a great irony that the Germans, of course, in their Nazi period, invaded and occupied Ukraine, massacred massive numbers of people, not just Jews, though every Jew they could get their hands on, but massacred hundreds of thousands of people in Ukraine. And now they're back on the streets of Kiev, acting through the foundations, the so-called NGOs, the Trojan horses that we always see in these color code revolutions.
Yeah, supporting these neo-Nazis and
Yeah.
anti-Semites.
Yeah.
To which Lana Del Rey responses, well, they would support flesh-eating zombies if it was in their geopolitical and economic interests. So no morals. Joe M. sends us a very powerful picture showing McCain sharing a meal with the Ukraine neo-Nazi party Svoboda. There he is, sitting with them at the table.
This is really important because McCain is one of the world's greatest supporters of Israel. He's in with all the Zionist organizations in the United States. They all supported his presidential run. And there he is in that picture having a meal with the leader of a party which is openly Nazi, which is openly anti-Semitic. Do the Jewish organizations in the United States not know this, or are they just keeping quiet about it?
About Bloody Sunday, well, we discussed about how on the eve of it they started raising the flags. And
This is the flags of the parachute regiment that did the killing.
Yes, yeah. Garrett sent us a picture of it, how flags are being erected in Irish streets today. Member of Sinn Féin Michael McCrossan sent us a few others from the Bloody Sunday anniversary itself, saying, I just spoke on Drive 105, reiterating my call for unionist leaders to use their influence to ensure British paraflags are removed in Derry.
Actually, the British Army should require the bringing down of these flags. This is a provocation designed to shed still more blood. What right do loyalist thugs have to erect the flag of the parachute regiment of the British Army? This insignia belongs to the British Army, and the British Army is controlled by the British government, and they should make sure that the police take down these flags right away, because on the eve of an anniversary in which the parachutists killed 14 unarmed demonstrators, that's a provocation asking for real trouble.
And everybody knows it. It's nobody in the right mind would dare to go up that lamppost except this bunch of
What kind of person
hooligans.
would climb a lamppost to put up an army flag of a regiment that killed 14 of your fellow citizens in your city all these decades ago?
Fortunately, the local residents did not rise to the provocation.
Indeed.
Well, that's it for this week.
Which sadly means that's all we've got time for.
You know where to reach us on Twitter. It's at RT_Sputnik. And on Facebook, you can find us at Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.